This is one of the talks. It was co-hosted by the Gilbrea Centre in the School of Geography and Earth Sciences, and we're pleased that you're able to be with us today. We do these seminars, they're small seminars on a range of topics, but in this case it's about health and advanced stage, and there's a good connection, and Janine's a geographer and a gerontologist, so it's the perfect opportunity to bring the centre and the department together. Janine is an associate professor in the School of Population Health at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And we're lucky that she's made the trip to McMaster today. She's a visiting scholar at the moment at Trent Centre for Aging and Aging Studies, or Aging and Society, sorry, in Peterborough. So she's here from September until January, I think is the term. Her work is in the fields of geography and gerontology. She teaches in community development, works on qualitative research methodologies, etc. And so please join me in welcoming Janine today. She'll be speaking to us about health and advanced stage. We're here for an hour. Janine will probably speak somewhere up to about 40 minutes or so, and we'll reserve the last 15 minutes a little bit more for questions. Okay?
Hello everybody and welcome, and thank you for the really warm welcome from the Gilbrea Centre and from the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to talk today a little bit about some research, but in New Zealand it's very important that we introduce ourselves first and tell you a bit. If I were Māori, I'd tell you about my whakapapa, or where I've come from. So I'm a geographer, as Amanda said. I've done lots of work around resilience in place, and aging in place, for example. My earlier work was around care at home. I'm also a gerontologist, so thinking around very much from the social and participatory way around thinking around gerontology. I now work in a school of population health, which is really fun because I get to collaborate with lots of different groups. I really enjoy that. And our particular school, we're a strong focus on equity and inequalities and on social determinants of health, particularly the more upstream determinants of health, so in an environment where we think like that. And I do a lot of work, my work is qualitative, and I'm really interested in talk, so performativity, and the way that talk is productive of the world as well as being representative of the world. So I'm very interested in narrative and positioning theory, and I'll talk a bit about some of that today. So I started off, I was a bit of a peripatetic academic for a while, so I started off in New Zealand at Otago University. I actually worked here in Canada. I did my PhD at Queen's University, where I studied with Mark Rosenberg there. Then I went to St Andrews University in Scotland, where I taught in this School of Geography and Geosciences there for a little bit in the early 2000s, and came back and worked at McGill Grove here in Mandarin. I was a colleague there, and went back to New Zealand, back home to Auckland about 12 years ago. So, and what I'm going to do today is talk about a suite of 3 interconnected projects. It's been really interesting for me to think about these 3 sort of at a broader level, because I've been part of all of them. So the first is a project led by Professor Naira Kuris, who's a general practitioner and researcher in the School of Population Health, and there's been several Māori co-leaders of that research, so Dr. Lorna Dial, and then Anna Rolliston, and currently Marama Murulani, co-leaders of that project. This was a longitudinal study of advanced old age, and I'll talk a little bit about that project too. A related project to that, sister project if you like, is Te Pākehitanga, which is led by Professor Miriam Gott, and that was looking at life and living, or end-of-life experiences in advanced age, and I'll talk a little bit about that because end-of-life in advanced age has quite different experiences. And then I'll circle right back in to a qualitative sub-study of Wiles, which I led, where we did some interviews with participants in that bigger longitudinal multidisciplinary study. And I'd like to start actually by offering thanks and gratitude to the participants in all of those studies. I don't want to leave that to the end, I want to do it now. They were really generous, all the people in these studies, huge amounts of time and generosity. In Lilacs and the Managing Health study, we had 7 community sites, and those people that were part of that were very, very helpful for all of the research. We also have in all of these projects strong groups of Māori advisors. In the Lilacs project, Rupi Katiaki, who oversee and guide the project. In the Pākehitanga, There's a Te Aro research group, again, a group of kaumātua Māori elders who guide and oversee all of the research. And of course there's a range of funders, so the Health Research Council of New Zealand, the Ministry of Health, and the Auckland University as well. So LIVEX, as I said, was a longitudinal multidisciplinary study. There's a huge cast of researchers in this, there's geriatricians and nutritionists and so on. We were aiming to look at what are the predictors of successful ageing and look at the trajectories of ageing in advanced age. And so in a particular area of New Zealand, has anyone ever been to New Zealand here? Okay. So some of you will be familiar with the North Island, Rotorua, which is the touristy place. A lot of you would want to see Muckles is right around in this area in Taupo. And so we picked this area because it has a range of rural and urban. In the western part, we've got Tauranga City, which is quite to you a small city, but a rapidly growing city. And as you come out to the east, it's very rural and very remote. It's much more poverty out through there. It's sort of quite urban through here, but small towns. I grew up just in this town here. We invited in that area everybody who was non-Māori, Māori being the indigenous population of New Zealand. Now, you see all of these studies are structured along Māori and non-Māori. That's because in New Zealand, our founding constitutional document is the Treaty of Waitangi. And so there's an onus on us as researchers to always think about partnership and participation and protection. We always think about Māori and non-Māori. There's also an equity issue there in that Māori have much different life expectancy. So for advanced age particularly, we have a different group. So we invited everybody non-Māori who was born in 1925 to participate in the study, and everybody Māori who was born between 1920 and 1930. That meant 85-year-olds and 80 to 90-year-olds. There was a lot of, there's a big feasibility study that we did beforehand to see how this would work. We ended up working with 7 community sites, which included Indigenous healthcare providers as well as community groups who became the interviewers, and they conducted a lot of the research here. We were aiming for equal explanatory power for the Māori and the non-Māori group, which is why we have the different age bands. We had bilingual documents and translated things, and these were interviews with people every year. They took a minimum of 2 hours, often a bit longer, for a whole suite of test ECGs and so on that were going on. But we were looking at a whole lot of measures of health. So we had diagnostic reports from GP records and hospital discharge data. There was a big study of nutritional impact. We had self-reported mental and physical health and functional status and so on. And this image is the Luka Kaitiaki. That's the group of Māori kaumātua and kui or elders who oversaw it, and in some cases contributed questions to the questionnaires. We hope to do this study to follow those cohorts every year until then. It actually turned out to be really difficult to get funding for a study of advanced age. So far we've been able to do 6 waves of data, and it's on hold at the moment. Just briefly, you don't need to look at all this, but we have these 2 quite distinct cohorts. We've got about 56% recruitment rate from the whole potential population we could have got, and they represent pretty well what we can look at in terms of census records, what we would expect to have. Except that for the non-Māori males, we've got a slightly higher proportion of males. So for the Māori group, I just wanted to note there's quite a high proportion of them live with someone other than a spouse, so that intergenerational living arrangements, which is represented on a more collective kind of culture. The non-Māori group, a much higher proportion of them, about almost 1 in 5, live in retirement villages of some sort. Almost nobody in the Māori cohort live in a retirement village. But there are much higher proportions of renters in the Māori cohort. And this is in a culture where we have very high rates of home ownership, or traditionally we've had very high rates of home ownership. So there's masses of findings from LIVEX, and I put the website down there, but just a couple of interesting examples. One is that the mental health related quality of life was moderately high for this group, but physical health related quality of life moderately low, which we kind of would expect. Most of our participants maintained functional status from one year to the next. It wasn't a massive decline that we might expect. but 15 to 80% actually improved in functioning. Some really interesting trajectories of functional decline that go on over the 6 waves. Around a fifth continued to volunteer in leadership roles, multicultural roles in organisations. So kaumātua and kuia tend to play a very active role in Māori society. They're one of the more important parts of Māori collective society and have quite busy roles on marae and teaching. There's voluntary organisations, most of which were health-related or community religious organisations. And I find this quite interesting because I'm at the moment working on some of the, we had a few open-ended questions where we asked people about their advice about advanced stage and the highlights of advanced stage. And one of the main highlights that people talked about was contributing to the community. It was their volunteer roles, it was the things that they did for others. There was also a really big nutrition study, and that was a very detailed study of intake over 24 hours. This was a really interesting study, partly because the results are interesting. A lot of the nutrition guidelines don't go above a certain age, they only go up to about the late 70s or so. So we don't really know for people in advanced stage what are the appropriate guidelines. What we could see from that is that almost half of Māori and well over a third of non-Māori were at high nutrition risk, especially for intake of protein and to some extent carbohydrate. So there's some interesting findings there. This part of the study was also interesting because it was one of the most controversial parts of the study that we had for a variety of reasons. One of the parts of this that I was particularly interested in is attachment to place and well-being. And so I've been really interested for a long time in place attachment, and particularly in a sort of more qualitative way. In this study, we were able to measure people's feelings of attachment. So we're looking at place attachment both as a means to age in place in the sense of the familiarity and the security that enable people to stay put, as it were, but also the reason why, the motivation for aging in place. And I like Elizabeth Donda's work around the distinction between how satisfied or the effective feeling you have in place, but also the sense of participation or connectedness that you have in place. So we found some really interesting, it was interesting to find the associations with health, but that they were complex. So they work very differently for Māori and for non-Māori. So most of our, as we would expect, most people lived at home and wished and intended to do so, and most people had very strong positive affect for home, which again we would expect. It was positively associated with the health indicators, so functional status and both physical and mental health and quality of life. But for Māori, there was a significant association with your feelings about nature and the outdoors. Now this is particularly interesting because that was a question that the Rupukatiaki insisted that we have in our questionnaire. It wasn't something that we had thought to include, and they said, "No, this is really important, we need to include this." So for Māori, that became, it did have a significant association, as did feeling connected to one's community, but not for them feeling how much you might like your home or your particular neighbourhood. Whereas for the non-Māori cohort, those things were important. How well you liked your home and your neighbourhood, and also how connected you felt to it. And we think, we can only speculate, but we think that perhaps reflects that Māori culture is more collective, it's more about whakawhanaungatanga, social relationships, and it may be related to that. We could also see that feeling connected, how connected you felt to your community, the response to that was more moderate, which is interesting because older people tend to respond quite positively to questions like this. But there were also stronger associations with health and well-being, so those connections were stronger. For Māori, feeling there was it wasn't a straight linear relationship between, for example, functional status. So those who were the most functionally disabled, if you like, actually had the strongest sense of connection to community. And going back to the earlier statement where less Māori are living in retirement villages, there's also less living in residential care. We think that that might be about the connectedness that you need to be able to stay in the community with lower function. Those who were anticipating, there was more, so interesting, we asked people about whether they preferred to stay in place and whether they intended to stay in place. And there were some interesting associations there too. So most people preferred to stay where they were and intended to, but those who would prefer to move and but didn't think that they would be able to have poorer mental quality of life. We think that's probably something to do around the tipping point, some of Stephen Hilland's work, where we've reached a point where it's actually going to be very difficult now to move to adjust to the living environment. Now this is a group, as I said, 85 plus, and so this is some work by Heather McLeod, who's part of the Te Arai team. And so I'm now moving on to sort of talk about lilacs and Tākitanga study. So what I just want to highlight here is this is the projections of deaths by age band, and this is similar for many countries. And what you can see for 85 plus, by 2061, there's this massive increase. A huge proportion and number of our deaths will be in very advanced age. But we don't know much about that. We're not well prepared for this. There's not a lot of connection between palliative care, for example, and gerontology. We need to get better at that. And so Te Pakeketanga is a really interesting study. The other thing to note here, this is the location of death among people aged 65 plus. And again, this is from work by Jo Broad, who is part of the Lilacs team. This was her PhD work. And she was looking at place of death, so whether it's hospital in the orange, residential aged care, or other, it's at home, where people are dying in older age. And this is for people aged 65, but the percentage of deaths in residential aged care doubles for those aged 74 to 85, and doubles again over 85. So in effect, what you can see is residential aged care becoming de facto palliative care system, which is why it matters that we start working in how these things work together. But the risk of dying in acute hospitals is massively reduced for those aged 85. And you can see that in New Zealand, we have very high proportions of people living in residential aged care. We're not really sure why, but our proportions relative to the OECD countries are very high. So you can see for us, about a third of deaths are in hospital, just over a third in residential aged care. This is Canada, Manitoba and Ontario. We can see it's almost a half in hospital. It's quite different rates. The purpose of this is all to think about, I've lost the slide, I've messed up my slides. But the Pakeketanga was a study we paired with lilacs. So in lilacs there were 3 waves of questionnaires where the older people, people aged 85 or 80 to 90 were asked, did they feel comfortable to answer questions about their end-of-life plans. And those who said yes were then asked a series of questions about their end-of-life preferences. And this is some of the findings from that. So this is data gathered there. And what's interesting about this is that contrary to a lot of the research that suggests people wish to die at home, that was a very low priority for most of the people in this study. Like being the top ranked priority was not to be a burden to my family. And we think this has really interesting implications for the whole kind of discussion around end of life and assisted dying and so on. So we think this is probably related to internalized aging and implications of that. This is contra to most of the palliative care policy that we have internationally. All things like pain and symptom control, having affairs sorted out, spiritual concerns were ranked higher than dying at home. There are differences by gender and by culture. So for our Māori cohort, women were more likely to have talked to their family and to be concerned about spiritual affairs. For the non-Māori cohort, men were more likely to be keen to have interventions or resuscitation than women. So these are really important issues that come up because this is something a lot of people haven't talked about with their families. And this became clear in the next part of the study, which is Te Pakeketanga. So this was a study at the same time that people were asked to answer those end-of-life questions. They were asked to nominate a main care provider who, if they were to pass away during the time of the study, that we could talk to. Those people were also contacted at that time to say, this is you'll be nominated, are you okay with this? We'll be able to contact you. And then there was a period of time where we had the nominated carers, there were 52 older people who passed away during that time, and we contacted those carers. It was a very high response rate, a recruitment rate there. Only a few people actually said, no, this is not okay. We had done quite a lot of consultation beforehand about when would be appropriate, how would people like to be approached and so on. So they were approached through those community sites by interviewers who they already knew to some extent. We ended up talking with 58 carers, so there were a couple of, there were 2 instances where it was a spouse who wasn't ready to talk, but suggested we talk to an adult child. And then there were 6 or so where they said, yes, I'll talk about it, but you should also talk to my daughter or my sister or somebody else. So that's why we had 58. The interviews were what we call kaupapa Māori consistent. It means consistent with Māori values. So we always took food or kai, for example. People were offered if they would like to have a karakia or prayer and waiata or a song before and at the end of interviews. Our Māori researcher always led all of the interviews actually, and there were always 2 Māori researchers present at interviews for Māori. We did something called collaborative story production, so we took back straight away afterwards a summary that was a story of that person's life. We worked with participants to create that into often quite an elaborate and beautifully illustrated taonga or treasure. It's a story of that person's life. Family would often contribute photographs and letters and things to these, for example. And we made those, we published just this year an article about that process because it was a really important part of the research process. We also collaborated with our team in the Faculty of Arts, so Shushi Kothari and Serena Pearson, who are documentary filmmakers, and we made a documentary film of our findings. So we took findings and transcripts, we made sure that they were slightly anonymised, so we changed details, kind of any identifying details, and they put together a story and actors wrote the story. So I've got this is the front end of our Te Aroha research site, and please do go and have a look at this because there's heaps of research going on here. But we created the documentary film, and then as a research team went back to each of the sites and invited all of the palliative care clinicians and so on working in those areas to come and view the film with us and talk with us. And that was it's been a really exciting way of translating that knowledge. It's that film that's being used now in GP continuing education, for example, and discussion groups, and it was a really profound way to convey our findings from that work. So the study participant characteristics, they're quite an interesting group because most of them wouldn't have identified themselves as caregivers. They've been identified by the older person. We do get that kind of typical, mostly female, mostly they were children of the person, so it's quite similar in that way. It was about 2/3 were non-Māori, 1/3 were Māori. So we get quite an interesting kind of group. Some of the interesting things around that research, one is that we really looked at this from in terms of the new public health or health promoting palliative care frameworks and Anna Kelly's work and so on that argue that we could think about prioritising more compassionate communities, looking at community care, suggesting that community networks can grow at end of life, for example, and that this can be a really important part of care, which we should be emphasising. What we found in this study for people in advanced stage, none of that was the case really. So typically it was very limited support beyond family. People weren't really getting support from the older person's community. They tended to find that at the very end of life people were withdrawn or not able to participate. The carers themselves felt that participation or help from communities wasn't really existent or very much there. There were lots of barriers to developing new networks, so transport issues or people being in residential care, and we didn't find any evidence of new networks forming, so it's quite a different experience at the end of life. Another work from that, we looked at the fragmentation of services from a perspective. This was one of probably the biggest issues for these family members, that the fragmentation between primary care and community care and secondary and tertiary. And they talk quite a lot about how the distress that this caused for family members, for the older person themselves as well as for them. So they talked a lot about that they were themselves stepping up. We don't have anything like a patient navigator role currently in the New Zealand healthcare system, but family members were often having to step into that role and learn a whole new landscape of care, but that their frustration that their knowledge and expertise was discounted. So I've got a quote there from a woman. what's happening there is that her husband had for 40 years had dry skin, so he used to scratch a lot. But she had arrived at hospital to find him gloved and gowned from head to toe because the hospital staff thought that he had scabies, and they refused to listen to her at all when she explained, "No, no, this is my knowledge of him. This is what I've always known." And we saw a lot of examples of that. We also saw families providing lots more technical support. So I've got the syringes and the morphine up there because there were several stories about being asked to administer morphine, for example, and having to do quite difficult things, and the difficulty of people having to do subcutaneous injections and so on. But the issue here was that was significantly impacting their grieving process and their bereavement process afterwards. They were feeling guilt about having caused pain, or did they do this right, or how did I end up in this situation? And for me, I put an older, so we've published it, but it really resonates for me with a lot of older work I did when I was working with Mark, where we were looking at the same kind of processes happening here in Canada. This kind of, we call it the private informalisation and the informal privatisation of healthcare. So another part of work we've just published from this is looking at care, and typically in the caregiving literature we focus a lot on caregiver burden and what happens to people. We focus a lot on caregiver kind of trajectories, but we don't often talk so much about the kind of complexities of the task. And so we felt very strongly when we looked at what people were doing. So on your right here, we've got these are the kind of tasks, the range of tasks that we could see people were doing at end of life. So a lot of them resonate with what we would expect from the caregiving literature. Some of them are very specific to end of life, so being with someone, being present with someone at the end of life, for example. And some of them are very specific to being with someone in advanced age. So, for example, taking on the role of enduring power of attorney, or when do you take that role on? How does that work? What we could see across for every single one of these tasks, what we argue is the doing. That's what we talk about a lot in terms of the caregiving literature, the task that people do. But there's also the knowing and the knowledge that caregivers have, either that they already have about that person or that they develop in terms of this role, and the negotiation. And that's really critical to think about. The negotiation with the older person, for example, negotiating, bringing in resources into the home, arranging help to come into the home, or arranging equipment to come in. Negotiation that goes on around, do you need some help? What are we going to call this? How will we do this? The negotiation with other family members, so some of the issues around who does what role, and why should they do that, and what is it. The negotiation with health professionals around what should happen and how should it happen. And so learning to negotiate, but when to be pushing and when to be moving back. So a lot of this was a really important part of the caregiving role. So this example of that kind of knowing, doing, negotiating. This is a woman talking about supporting her mother and actually her father at the same time. So the father was in hospital. She's negotiating that kind of process between her parents as the dad is whether he could come home or not. But also negotiating with health professionals about whether he could come home, and because her mother was going to become the primary caregiver at that point, and that it wasn't going to be something that would be possible. So she has to negotiate all of these different things going on in the caregiving role. And we think that's really important to talk about the complexity of caregiving roles and also how we can support caregivers better. Some of the work we're doing at the moment around this is, I'm not going to talk about this in lots of detail because I can see the time, but we're trying to think about an appreciative inquiry approach. So what did work really well in terms of, at the moment we're working on hospital care, what were the, we can look at in our data with these caregivers, we embedded in our interviews were some measures of satisfaction with hospital care or with the care that they're receiving. So we can take those who said that they were very happy with the care that they received, and actually there were 34 people who had care in hospital. Of those, 21 people said that they were either very or extremely happy with the care that they received. And so we're looking at, well, what characterises those people? What works well in hospitals that we can learn from? In this case, we're taking a compassionate care model and applying kaupapa Māori principles to it. So Mātua Rauri Wharamati, who's the lead kaumata in our Te Ara group, talked to us gave us this kind of principle of kapa manawa, that kind of fluttering of the heart. And so we've taken a model that's been developed in a Western framework and applied some, extended it really with some Māori principles and looking at how can we apply those in terms of what works. Which brings me to the third study that I want to talk about, the managing health study. So this study was building on Wiles. We had those big cohorts in Wiles. One of the things we identified in Wiles was that 93% of the cohorts had some kind of multimorbidity or comorbidity, more than one illness that they were living with. And part of the research team identified clusters of multimorbidity, effectively moving from more well to less well, different kinds of well clusters. So we were able to draw on that. We did 20 interviews. We were able to proposively sample, so half from the Māori cohort, half from the non-Māori. But we also proposively sampled geographically, so some people from more rural and some from more urban areas in a similar way to the overall cohorts, but also across those clusters of multimorbidity. And as the study went on, we more and more proposively sampled the people who would be more unwell, because one of the things that they insisted to us was that they were well. So we would know from the Wiles data that they had this long list of conditions that would suggest you wouldn't be very well, but they would tell us how well they were and how well they were coping. We also, as part of the study, we had focus groups with general practice groups, not just the GP, but the nurses and the practice managers and receptionists and so on, in 10 focus groups. And associated with those practices, a GP researcher did an interview with one of the GPs separately as well. And as the project went on, the community partner research sites got so interested, we also interviewed each of them. And so about their knowledge about Wiles participants, they were very protective of them. That's one of the issues that was coming up. So who could we talk to? So we were negotiating that with them, but we also realised how much they knew about these groups. They met with them every year and spent a lot of time with them. And we also, there was lots of chatter about Wiles itself, so we asked them about their experiences of that too. That's some really interesting material. So critically, we were drawing on ideas of resilience, we were drawing on ideas of interdependence and performativity and production of age. When I initially started this, I was looking at that multimorbidity data, how much co-management there would be. We sort of had this idea of people being passive recipients, but people who'd been living with chronic illnesses for a long time, I felt might have quite a lot to say about being involved. So in terms of our conceptual lenses, we were really interested in a lot of the literature in this field talks about balance and the negotiation of well-being and so on. We were really interested in creativity and adaptation and positivity, the way people deal with things, with illnesses particularly. We were interested in discursive resources, the way that people talk about illness and so on. We're really interested in the importance of place and how a place is a resource, but also place as a setting, place as all of those things. So for example, the resilience idea in previous work that I've done, and some people, Amanda for example, has done too, this idea that one can live with challenges and be healthy. And that was an idea about resilience that we conceptualised with older people in a previous project, and that was their kind of summary of resilience. But we've argued that it's very place dependent, so very dependent on the social aspects of place as well as physical and symbolic aspects of place. That it operates differently in different domains of our life, so I might have really strong mobility resilience, but less cultural resilience, which is very pertinent to our groups. It might operate at very personal scales or in my household, but also collectively in terms of the resources at a city level, for example, or at a national level. That it's an ongoing process. It might be sometimes about coping, it might be overcoming or adaptation at other times. And I think this idea that it includes a balance of vulnerability and strength and the ongoingness of that is really important too. In terms of striving for control, this seems to be a really important idea in the literature, and we were interested in that as we looked at our interviews and thought about what people were saying. So that maybe people might view their health quite positively and structure their thoughts and their talk quite positively. And this is something that does come through really strongly in our data. That it might take steps to control it or relinquish control to another source. And this idea of being challenged but not threatened, which is one of the first publications we had from our data. So it's this real issue that you have people that are living with quite high levels of illness or injury, often injury, ongoing fatigue, but describe themselves as being well. You have this multi-morbidity literature that says multi-morbidity is associated with greater complexity and cost and so on and so on. All these issues that come up. So how do we kind of understand that? And analytically, as I said, I'm really interested in interview talk. How do we deal with interview talk in a meaningful way? And so a thematic analysis is helpful, but I'm really interested in discourse and performativity. So we've Judith Butler's idea about how we kind of draw on these tacit collective norms and reproduce them and resist them and challenge them and negotiate with them. And produce bodies and spaces. And so positioning theory, I find a really helpful way to think about that. So moving away from kind of an idea of social roles towards social positions, which is the idea that all social positions have rights and privileges associated with them, but they also have responsibilities. And that we might be positioning ourselves, but we are positioned by others, and some really interesting kind of ideas around that. So we can look at what's being said and what that does in the world, and the storylines or the tacit kind of values that people are drawing on to do that, but then also the positions that that creates, which are always being negotiated. They're always a bit unstable and not really working. So working in lots of different ways, sorry, I should say. So they can be renegotiated all the time. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but this is a sense of the wide variety of resources that people were drawing on. We're adding to this all the time. Every time I read through the transcripts, I think about new examples of this, but there's a really wide variety. Some of them, the traditional things we would expect, so family and whānau. Whānau is extended family, so Māori for that. Environmental modifications. But they were also drawing on things like a sense of finitude, this idea that there's an ending to things and a finish, kind of limitations that we have. Resting comes up as really important, routines that people use. There's a really wide variety of resources that people use. One of the overall arching kind of things was the downplaying of illness. So initially when we started doing the interviews, I was working with Oniroa Stewart and Philippa Muskelly, and we would meet regularly. And they kept coming back and saying, they just tell us, it would come away from interviews with the sense of someone who felt that they were in very good health. Yet we would know that something was happening. And when we listened a bit more carefully, so at first we thought they were downplaying. That's why we started to compulsively sample people that we knew would not be well. We realised that actually it was very carefully structured talk. They didn't deny that they were unwell. And if you listen carefully, they would sort of drop in. There's some notes from Oniroa's interview. Every 10 minutes or so, they'd bring up another complaint. Or Philippa's interview, initially he presents as if everything's fine, but it becomes clear that he's... But they would definitely come away from these interviews with this overwhelming sense that of everything having been downplayed. They might get told on the doorstep about the heart event that I just had, or the significant cancer scare that I had last week, but it'll be on the doorstep as they were leaving. It wouldn't have been a major kind of thing. So it's very carefully structured talk, we realised. And typically, the reason they were getting that impression when you look really closely at the talk is that it's almost always framed within a solution. I had that heart event, but then I did this about it, or this is what I did about it. They tended to celebrate what went well, and they were really focused on the strategies that they used to manage and overcome. So here's an example. This is an example of that kind of idea of downplaying. Several different people talking. All of these people have quite significant comorbidities that they're dealing with, but to make it sound like I've got these complaints, the interviewer had just listed the complaints that we, the illnesses that we had. It's a worrying trend if you worry. This is following a conversation about massive heart event. Or I've been really lucky. This is someone who's just who's experienced quite massive health issues throughout his life. And so in all of these cases, these storylines that they're drawing on about luck, good genes, and this idea that it's not helpful to focus or worry, being positive. The storylines that they're emphatically rejecting are about complaining all the time. There's this really strong kind of effort to impress our interviewers, I think, that we don't complain. I'm not a complainer. The idea of old age being associated with illness or decline, that was a lot more ambivalent. Sometimes they would draw on that as a resource. It was quite a helpful thing to use. Sometimes they reject it, and it could be the same within the same conversation from minute to minute sometimes. And so there's positions that come up around doing better than might be expected relative to my peers, for example. being fortunate, but at the same time, I work hard for that. Not being a warrior, and this idea of being challenged. It is challenging. They're not denying, and I don't want to give you the impression that they're just blithely kind of pretending that things happen. That's not the case at all. They would talk about things, but not threatened. It's something that I can overcome. This is a conversation where the participants be describing a number of issues, and the interviewer asks, well, what does that mean? And he explains this does mean quite a lot in terms of compromising his mobility. But as she goes on, she asks him, as halfway down the page, does this impact on your life? Oh, no, that you work around it, and straight into being great, this kind of storyline of being grateful for having good health. When she asked him how it made her feel, there's a sort of pause there at that point, and it is quite hard. But then again, goes straight into the ways that he deals with it. So frame it in this particular way. And his spouse at that point kind of comments about, well, we've learned to accept quite a lot, and he sort of quite quickly, have to, and then goes on to, switches the conversation into another story. And so this idea from Karen Roberto's work about that medical diagnosis, contrary to what the health professionals are talking about, but just not the sole or even the main factor about how people identify themselves. This is a storyline from an older man who was in a position where his family were really keen for him to go into residential care. And so throughout the interview, he talked a lot about all the resources that enabled him to stay at home. He was adamant that he would stay at home. He talks about the relationship he has with his son, who's clearly coming by each day to support him. The neighbours bring him food. There's a paid help comes in. There are a number of other things that he talked about that enabled him to do this. But his story at the top, his way of summing up, I've been very, very lucky. And what's really exciting to him at night is I should be being looked after and all that, but I'm independent. And the other thing that comes through his whole narrative is the ways that he contributes. So whilst he does acknowledge all of the support he gets, every single time it's about what he gives back, both now and what he has given back throughout his life. So the storylines are the reciprocity of those relationships. Reciprocity was really strong. That he's interested and interesting. I'm a newsman. My son comes and watches sports with me. I'm not, it's fun. We're friends. We get on well. I'm lucky. I'm negotiating. What is totally absent from his storyline is any sense of being a care recipient. Yet in all of that caregiving literature, this would be someone we would position as a care recipient. I find that really interesting. He doesn't ever once see himself or portray himself like that. Absent that older people are demanding. Instead, he's a family man, he's a neighbour, he's a friend, all of these things. And this sense of interdependency that all of the people in that network rely on him as much as he does, or to some extent as he does on them. I think that's really interesting. So this idea of these webs of interdependence across time and space, that being a recipient is only one part of your identity. It's that kind of giving and receiving that you do, that emphasis on exchange and reciprocity. And the idea, this is one of my favourite papers I've ever done, and for a lot of reasons. It was in that really nice journal, and it was a really great experience working there. I often talk to students about kind of the valuable feedback, it was a really positive experience. But for personal reasons, this was something I was thinking a lot about, is that vulnerability is something that all of us have. We all go through transformations. It's just that some of us have the privilege of making that less visible than others. And so for people in an advanced stage where it's become made very visible, this kind of negotiation of that. And that maybe we should be reclaiming or rethinking about how we talk about vulnerability, because it's also receptiveness and openness. It forces us to change and think harder about the way we relate to other people around us and the way we relate to the places that we're part of as well. It makes those things really visible, but it also changes the way we think about it. At the moment I'm trying to figure through how we think about interactions with health services, the way that our participants talked about that. So there was really deep, hugely deep faith in professional knowledge, but not very much interest in participating in political decisions. People knew lots about them, but they weren't interested in participating that much. There were a few outliers, so they were typically people who felt that they had been marginalised, or that their physicians weren't taking them seriously because of their age. But there was a really strong sense of partnership, so they talked a lot about how they cooperate and apply, and they talked about their role. So the physician's role is to do the technical things. I manage my health quite actively in terms of my nutrition, for example, and managing my attitude and engage my relationships, all the kind of work you could see the previous guy talking about. And they really emphasise the continuity of the relationship. So it seemed a lot like the communication and the interpersonal relations were much more important than the information. They really emphasised that. I'm going to just skip through these. So in terms of resources for wellbeing, lots of demedicalisation. There's a lot of resistance to those really strong biomedical discourses around complexity, for example, and all that. Positioning of their selves being about acceptance and dignity, being in control, being hardworking, and of being in partnership with health experts as their expertise in their particular area. And this kind of creative adaptation to loss. They weren't denying loss, they talked about it a lot, but it's sort of how they adapt to it, and this ideas of disruption and flow. So the implications of that, I think, that we do really need to work with older people to support and maintain well-being rather than imposing things on people. And that the ways we need to offer support need to be able to recognise that interdependence rather than making people sort of say that you're frail or you're falling off the bottom of the cliff, which is a lot of how our services work at the moment, that you're only eligible for services once you've reached a certain point. We need to move our eligibility criteria and move away from that really narrow focus towards supporting those coping and adapting and creative repertoires that people have. And I'll finish it there, and I'm just going to leave that slide up to talk about our conference at the next year, which I'm happy to talk about. Yeah. And I'm happy to.
Thank you. Thanks for giving us an overview of the work you've been doing. We can open the floor to questions, things that you'd like to know a little bit more about.
In New Zealand, do you have assisted dying legislation?
We don't have legislation yet. It's a conversation on the table. Yeah.
I'm wondering how you think that would affect any of what you've just been talking about. I know it's a very big open-ended question.
Yeah, it is. I think we think that information should be part of that conversation. So the fact that the number one point for people in advanced stage was not to be a burden, I think that's really critical. We need to have that as part of the conversation. We don't have legislation at the moment, but it's certainly very much a part of a public discussion going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I asked, because one of the things that you mentioned very early on, high priority for people, in fact, the top priority was not being a burden on their family.
Yeah. And we can see that the vast majority of deaths in the next 40 years will be in advanced stage. So those are, and combined with that kind of sense of ageism that we have such negative stereotypes around aging, I think that's really critical. We need to think about that quite carefully. Yeah. There's also some really interesting issues around culture and values about life and assisted dying. There's people in our school working on some of those issues.
This is a twofold question. So what were some of the recommendations that came from your research to improve, let's say, public health practice or palliative care? And what are some of the things that have come from that?
To me, in terms of what works well?
Yes, so
Yeah.
what did you find that you would want to be recommended in practice or care?
So we've just submitted some work actually on exactly that. Looking at compassionate care. So what worked well for people was often the little things that just taking time, showing that they cared, taking time to get to know people, making sure they communicated, even when it's difficult, if someone's cognitively impaired or there are hearing issues, but making sure that they took the time to do it. Sharing small things that people in hospitals, for example, could do. And we think that that's about enabling the culture of a hospital. It's not just individuals doing that, because we have to be careful about caregiver burnout and experiences that. It needs to be about the culture of a whole hospital and its institutional structures that enable that to happen. And it has to come from the top. So we're also thinking a lot about residential care, because you see that big group there, and there's a lot of work in the Tiara group around engaging between palliative care and gerontology care and starting those conversations from that research, there's another project that started looking at deaths in residential care, talking with caregivers in residential care and family members about particular experiences. Yeah, so we're working on February. Yeah.
So you were talking about fragmentation of services.
Yeah.
So were they not here to take care of these people?
People in advanced stage tend to fall through the cracks. So one of the things I skipped over was that primary care teams said the same thing. So from the family physician's perspective, one of their greatest frustrations was the fragmentation between them, general practice, and community care providers, that where they used to work together a lot more, now they're much more separated. New Zealand, we have a managed competition kind of style of health delivery. And they also talked about fragmentation between them and secondary and tertiary care. And families talked about the same issue. So a GP might be prescribing X to their patient who they've had for, a lot of these patients have had the same GP for 20, 30 more years. But that person would go to hospital and the doctors would change all the meds. That's often not communicated to the general practitioner. Perhaps they might get a letter a few weeks later, months later sometimes. It's a bit confusing to the patient as well, so that kind of presentation. Yeah. They talked about this idea of 5 cars in a driveway. So even within the community services, because they're all on contracts, they don't work together very well. So you might have someone come in to address the wound here and somebody else is coming in to deal with another kind of, with the blood pressure, and there's all these different things. It's not the one person that they're dealing with, so that kind of fragmentation. But also the kind of slipping in the cracks that people weren't getting a lot of support from the community. We had this idea that it would be great to have death at home in the community, and that it would be about community, but it wasn't the experience of people in the front stage.
I'm just wondering, in your research, did you find that a lot of your participants felt more empowered when the resources were coming from almost like a bottom-up perspective, like from the community, or did they caregivers as well feel more empowered when it came from, like, the supports came from legislation or government policies?
That's a good question. It's hard. It's a good question. Yeah. You're doing some work on that? Is that?
I also do research on caregivers, actually.
Right. Yeah, a bit of both, I think. I think in terms of the Pākehā study, for the care families who weren't being interviewed as carers necessarily, that's what's interesting about that group. They're being interviewed about the end of life experiences of the older person. But where was I going to go with it? The sense that just it was an impenetrable landscape to them. Yeah. So some people had quite good care. We had examples, and another one of our kind of looking at the framework of what a positive inquiry framework is. There are families where there was a good death experience, and what was it about that? Sometimes it's because the whole family, there's intergenerations of carers and they're getting support. So one of the things that I think does come through really clearly is that lots of families had somebody in the family who works in the health system. So they had health system literacy. They know how the system works. They know the language to use. They know how to push and who to ask and where to go. And they tended to have a much better experience. So it's a little bit of both of what you're saying in a way. They understand the legislative frameworks and so on and what their rights are, but they also have connections, grassroots connections too. I know I'm not answering your question.
That's okay. It's a bit
It'd be interesting to talk more about it.
This is more if you think there was a significant difference having like the more people involved in the interview, like being part of the whole process,
Yes.
and how that can be adapted in practice, like getting
It makes a massive difference. It's really important. It's really important in all three of these studies. In the Lilac study, which is a more traditional clinical and survey questionnaire, but there's Māori leadership, there's Māori oversight and guidance, there's Māori translated documents, and there's Māori involvement and analysis at every step. So we're very careful about how we don't try not to compare, for example, because we don't want to have deficit theorising. It does make a big difference. In New Zealand, we talk a lot about kaupapa Māori research, which is research by Māori for Māori with Māori. I'm not Māori, so I can't do kapa Māori, but I can do kapa Māori consistent. I can learn about those values. So we try and do that in the work. Can it be translated?
Yeah, in Canada, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
indigenous people,
Yes.
and how can we get them involved in research? How do you go about that?
So I don't think we've got it all worked out in New Zealand that we do. In New Zealand we have, so any kind of funding application or ethics application you do, you have to talk about Māori responsiveness. It's absolutely critical. You don't get funding unless you can do that. One of the issues is workforce capacity. So most of our Māori researchers are massively overworked. They kind of get brought into projects and it's really difficult. So I actually really believe really strongly that as I said, the Treaty of Waitangi is our constitutional document. We're partners in that. As a non-Māori, I have a partnership, I have a role, a responsibility to uphold and protect that. So to nurture and protect Māori researchers, for example, I see as a really significant part of my job. It's what I am required to do. So we all need to be doing that and building capacity. But it has to be at that institutional level too. I think the fact that everything is contingent on Māori involvement and participation is really important. But we don't have it all right yet. We haven't got it all right. And a lot of research doesn't do that. The Lilac study was a really brave study, what they did in a lot of ways. And yeah, we haven't got it right. These are not typical studies in that sense. Yeah. I think it's really important.
Well, thank you. I'd like to also thank the Gilbert Center and the Department of School of Geography and Earth Sciences. Thanks. It was really lovely to see you again and hear about your work. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for all of your questions. And I'm sure we'll be around for a few minutes if you have additional questions.